Hello, everyone, and welcome to a February Friday Goldster Inside Story, an interview show, which is not only live and virtual like we are now, but it's also on podcast, catch up, live streamed. And yesterday we had an inaugural live in-person show with the super best-selling writer Greg Hurwitz at the Riverstone Cinema in London. And there I mentioned this morning that we would be meeting an author of a book that, well, imagine Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird meets Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, set that in the 21st century in racially torn South Africa, and that is what we're going to be discussing today. Greg Hurwitz was gripped, as were his publishers, and we are about to dive very deeply into a chilling story, and I've got it here, if it comes up. These are not gentle people. 2 dead men, 40 suspects, the trial that broke a South African town. Not only is it a compelling story, it is also beautifully written, taking us inside the scenes and the minds of those involved. Now, the author, and you can see him there, looking so mild-mannered, with fashionable stubble in his Johannesburg house. I think he's the first one we've had from South Africa. But he's recently been on the front line in Ukraine. And some of you would have seen his incisive and measured reporting for the BBC. And as that war goes on, he will be back together with reporting on any crisis in the continent of Africa. So before he rushes off for another assignment, let us welcome Andrew Harding to Goldster Inside Story.
Thank you very much, Humphrey, and welcome from a rather drizzly Johannesburg. Me with my holiday beard just coming in after my last trip, and I'll probably have to shave it off again. I'm not sure the BBC is quite ready for that.
How long do you grow it, Andrew? Do you let it go sort of Gandalfian?
Oh, no, well, I haven't got that far yet, no, but I've never had quite long enough. That's the only restriction, really. Time, not style.
You're not allowed to have a beard on air, is that right?
Well, I actually have noticed Jeremy Bowen has started sporting a beard, so I could probably get away with it now that it's coming into fashion, I think. But for a long time, it was an absolute no-no. And I think that the sort of grey, maybe, I don't know, my cameraman in Ukraine is convinced I should have a beard, but I've never quite managed it.
Yeah, I don't. Oh, and what's that picture behind you? We've got, it looks very graphic.
So this is something that I bought in the late 1990s in Moscow, actually. It's a Soviet era, 1950s Ukrainian painting that we bought at the Central House of Artists on the riverbank in Moscow. And it's taken on a different sort of significance for me. We've always had it up in our homes wherever we've been since the 90s, which I spent in Russia and in the Caucasus. And it's a lovely picture. It reflects the sort of different ages of womanhood, with Soviet mother in the middle breastfeeding, and the elderly grandmother on the other side looking worried. But yes, I've been trying to investigate actually who painted it since the Ukraine war, because it feels like a bit of a piece of sort of history, and I'd love to know more about it. But the crazy 90s wasn't really a time for establishing those kind of details in Russia. Everything was kind of for sale.
Yes, you've just given us there the sort of breadth of your experience, which I want to get to later in the show. But I want to start off with These Are Not Gentle People, which is your latest book. You've got another one coming out soon, which we are also going to talk about later in the show. But the Washington Post called this magnificent and heartbreaking. Philip Sands, the famed international human rights lawyer, said utterly gripping and timely shocking. These are big people. Alexander McCall Smith, who writes the light-hearted #1 ladies detective agency, set in Botswana, I think, he described it as a book of profound importance. What is so profoundly important about it?
That's very kind of him. I actually met Alexander McCall Smith doing a story about an opera house that he'd opened in Botswana. And he'd written the libretto for the first opera, which was the Okavango Macbeth. And it was a fantastic production. We went and met him. This was probably a decade ago or more. But to return to your question, Humphrey, it's very kind of him to say that. What I was hoping to do was to pick a small story that could illustrate something more profound about South Africa. And I think what the story I stumbled on does expose is what's going wrong here, frankly, the infrastructural, institutional rot that right now is taking shape in every South African's life very sort of viscerally in the form of power cuts. We're lucky we don't have a power cut right now, but we had one this morning, we'll have one this afternoon, we'll have one again this evening. And this is the result of decades of poor planning, massive corruption, even political sabotage these days, and its sense of crisis that is starting to grip this fantastic, gorgeous, beautiful, incredible country, but which is going through really tough times after the Zuma era, a decade when the state was really hollowed out by corruption, by what they called state capture, cronyism. And so in this one little story that I stumbled upon in the Free State, in the center of South Africa, this double murder trial, this case that was really at some level about race, about the tensions between white farmers and black farm workers. But I wanted to see it as less through the lens of race and more about how everything that was supposed to deliver justice in this case let everybody down. All the institutions that were supposed to stand up for justice seemed to crumble, seemed to fail everyone involved. And so I hope that's what Alexander was talking about when he said his nice words about it.
So just give us, without giving the story away, set the scene for us of who murdered who and then what happened.
So this started back in 2016, just after New Year, in a field, a very dry field during a period of drought, just before sunset. And two black farm workers, poor in their early 30s, living in a shanty town, were running across the fields for their lives. And they were being chased by about 40 local white farmers, farm owners and their sons, who had been called to the scene to chase these two men when the sort of patriarch, the white patriarch of the farming community, an old man called Van der Westhuizen, had pressed his panic button in his little farmhouse. And he pressed it because he said 2 or 3 men had come to his door and were attempting to rob him. And he'd managed to press the alarm, and that had activated the security structures that are in place everywhere in South Africa, particularly for people like me who are middle class. We have panic buttons, we have electric fences here, we have armed responses, but particularly out on the farms, which are still overwhelmingly white owned, there is a real fear of violent crime because these white farmers are often on their own, they feel isolated, they often have cash, they often have guns, and so they are real targets for crime. So this man pressed the panic button immediately. This network of WhatsApp groups, the security company in the nearby town sent out a message to everyone, go and help him, go and track down these attackers, these robbers. And so within, I think probably an hour of tracking these two men, they were found. They were caught in a corner of a field as the sun was going down. And essentially my book is about what happened then, because an act of horrific, unprovoked, if you like, savagery took place because these two black farm workers were immediately seized. They were wrestled to the ground. They were tied up. They posed no more threat, but they were then subjected to hours of very brutal beatings by men who were furious, of course, anxious about the crime situation in their country, but incredibly violent. And the next day, by the time the police had found these men, taken them to the local hospital, both of them were dead. And so I heard about this case pretty soon afterwards and went down to Paris, which is the nearby town. It's a lovely, pretty little town, a tourist town on the Vaal River, and went into the magistrate's court where some of the white farmers who'd been involved in the arrest. Not sure. Well, you have to read the book to find out what they did. But they were accused by the police of killing these two men. And that was the start of a very long, very messy, tortuous, much delayed legal process that finally produced a judgment, a verdict that was deeply controversial. And I stuck with it. I kept on with my day job with the BBC, but I also kept going on down to Paris whenever the legal case developed. And I also did a Radio 4 series based on it called Bloodlands. Yeah, so that's how it started.
And when I mentioned To Kill a Mockingbird in Cold Blood and that sort of thing, are there comparisons to what we see or hear about in the sort of racism and violence that we see in the US to what you're talking about, or is it a completely different situation?
When you talk about those two books, which I'd be very wary of being considered in their company. I mean, I've loved them all my life, and I remember writing my dissertation at university in part about Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, along with Norman Mailer's The Executioner's Song. So they've always been in the back of my mind. And I suppose, to me, what always is foremost in any comparison like that is that I sought very consciously not to write a current affairs book. I wanted to emulate that kind of novelistic technique that we see in those books, particularly in Truman Capote's book. Controversial, that it was in terms of quite how true it was, quite how much liberty he took with his evidence. But what I did was I sat everyone down that I could who was involved in this case, and I did long interviews. And then I tried to construct a novel, essentially, from that, in which everything was true, but which I'd novelized it to the extent that I sort of structured it around the drama and don't kind of spell out the politics. It's about showing, not telling, what all this means.
And when you said you kept going backwards to do these interviews, do the research, were you welcomed back? Were you yourself in any danger there?
I don't think I was in danger, but there was certainly hostility, particularly from the Afrikaans white farming community, because understandably, they were suspicious of my motives. These are people who feel under siege, who talk, some of the more extreme amongst them talk of a genocide against them. I don't believe that's the case, but I also recognize, and I write a lot in the book about the sources of their anger and their insecurity and their frustrations. And so why is this guy, this Englishman, coming to this part of the Free State where, England, Britain, back through to the history of the Boer War, that's not forgotten yet. Why am I choosing a case which cuts against the grain, which is actually a story, a relatively rare case of farmers killing or beating to death suspected robbers? It cuts against the usual flow of things. And I guess I chose it because I think that sometimes those stories that go against the grain end up being much more revealing than simply a story, of one of these well-known horrific attacks on white farmers that we hear so much about. It's
30 plus years, isn't it, since Nelson Mandela's walk to freedom and the whole euphoria that encompassed the end of white rule in South Africa, apartheid. You gave a pretty graphic description of the current South Africa of today. What does your book say? I mean, not say, show about that. You've got the microcosm there about that whole euphoria that we in the West particularly thought would unfold under this panoply of democracy that would create a perfect place.
So South Africa is a really tricky country to report on, to try and encapsulate, because there's still plenty that's going right here. It is a stunning place, and you can drive around all of the country and see progress. Where I live here near a place called Rosebank in Johannesburg, apart from the power cuts, and apart from COVID, which really has hit very hard here, generally for the last decade or two, there's been progress, small businesses, and also on the racial front. You see so many more Black-owned businesses, Black middle class. And when you look at the surveys and the opinion polls, race really isn't much of an issue. It's all about concerns about the economy, concerns about unemployment, concerns about education. The education system here is really pretty shabby. The race issue is something that gets exploited by some smaller parties and by the governing ANC to some extent, particularly under the past president, who was looking to distract people from his own failings and his party's failings. So the race issue is certainly there. The rainbow nation of the Mandela era is not looking as sort of hopeful as it once was. But still, when I first approached this story, this case about, clearly to many South Africans, a case of appalling racism, I was a bit concerned because I didn't want to get dragged into a black and white, literally and metaphorically, story about us and them, these two sides, because I don't think that's what's going on here. And yet it's part of the story. But it's also a way into what I was saying earlier, the bigger sense of infrastructure and institutions being rotted away, how the prosecution did a rubbish job. The hospitals failed these two men. The whole process of land reform, which should, by now, 20 odd years later, have transformed South African farming into a multiracial success story, and which, if you talk to the white farmers, they're all desperate to be surrounded by prosperous black farmers. They don't want to be this oasis of white-owned privilege. They want the reforms to work, but the trouble is they've been done so badly. There's corruption. There's just not the kind of institutional strength in South Africa to push those reforms through. So yes, South African white farmers, maybe they could have done more, but they feel that they don't want to carry all the blame for the failures when it really is the government and the politicians who politicize it who are to blame.
I want to talk more about Africa generally, not just South Africa, because we've had people on the show that keep stressing to us that Africa is not a country. People talk about Africa, but actually it's a myriad of things. But before we go there was another story you did. You went into a microcosm of life and produced an earlier book called The Mayor of Mogadishu, which is a great title. Just tell us a nugget about that and how that compares to your style of writing that you've done for These Are Not Gentle People.
So I first came to Africa, to Nairobi in 2000, straight from a decade in the former Soviet Union. It was a time when the gangs and the warlords were in charge in Somalia, just to the north of Kenya. And so I found myself spending a lot of time there. Those were the days when you had to hire about 40 gunmen to travel around Mogadishu. And even then you couldn't travel beyond the neighborhoods controlled by that particular clan or sub-clan from whom you were getting the warlords and the gunmen to protect you. It was a crazy post-Black Hawk Down kind of Mad Max world. And then I went away to Asia for 4 years. And then I came back again to South Africa to do the kind of Africa BBC job. And by then, Somalia had changed again. The Islamists of Al-Shabaab, these Islamist militants had taken over, Al-Qaeda linked. The battle in Mogadishu, in Somalia's capital, had sort of turned into this kind of like Stalingrad kind of mortars and artillery and trenches right the way across the middle of this beautiful old city, the pearl of the Indian Ocean that had been the great hope of Africa post-independence back in the 60s and 70s. And I spent a lot of time there, and I was sort of addicted to Somalia because it's such a beautiful, such a fascinating place, and its people have experienced so many years of this extreme aggression, war, famine, misery, and yet they're still such extraordinary people. And I ran into one man called Tarzan. Well, that was his nickname.
Tarzan, as in
Tarzan. He got it
jungle.
in an orphanage in Mogadishu, having been a nomad, and then had been sent by his family to an orphanage after his father had died during a drought, and had grown up on the streets, tough guy, had ended up fleeing during the Civil War to go and live in Camden in North London for 20 years, had brought up a family there. And then in 2009 or 2010, he came back with a bunch of other diaspora Somalis to try to fight for a democratic government, to fight against the warlords and to fight against the militants. And I met him in the Villa Somalia, this presidential compound, right on the front line, and met in the basement all these terrified diaspora Somalis who come from America, Sweden, Camden, and were frankly appalled and terrified and wondering what the hell they'd done coming back to try and build a government in the middle of the ruins. And Tarzan was by far the most sort of dynamic, impressive guy. So I ended up spending a lot of time with him, and in the end wrote a book about his life. And it was much more of a journalist account because I'd had this incredible access, thanks to the BBC, all these years, sending me there, hiring the bodyguards, taking the time and the money to protect me and to allow me to have the access over all these years that very few other journalists had. So I thought, let me write a book about what it's like to experience that, but also mostly to talk about Tarzan and his life.
And when he was in Camden for 20 years, what did he do? Did he have a trade? Was he a lawyer? Was he a counselor? Was he a...
He was an entrepreneur. He set up he went to study because he'd not really studied. He studied business management. Then he opened an internet cafe. He became a local councillor, tried to become a local MP, failed. Frankly, was very depressed at times, was desperate to go back to Somalia, as so many of the diaspora are. I mean, they still talk about Somalia being the greatest country on earth. And I've just spent, despite this year being all about Ukraine, I've spent 4 long, difficult months in Ukraine, but I've had 3 trips back to Somalia at the end of last year to cover the famine there. Which isn't officially a famine, but which is basically a famine. It's still a bewitching and such a difficult, tortured place.
I want to talk about, just before we started going live, we were talking about regions, and you're an Africa correspondent, and they have Asia editors or correspondents in the BBC in Europe and whatever. These are the way that the West sees these regions. Would you be able to encapsulate it? You've worked in all of them, encapsulate those regions and then break down Africa for us and tell us what it actually is?
Well, as you say, Africa is not a country. It's very diverse. It's very difficult to generalize. And the days of the foreign correspondent where we sort of strode around places and pronounced on them and then went home to the UK, or our only readership or viewership was in the UK, are long gone. And there's a very immediate, very robust, and frankly, very helpful exchange now on social media, particularly when we wander around and try and sum up very complicated situations in short TV reports and generalize and get things, if not wrong, oversimplified. What I would say is that for a long time, you may have heard this expression, Africa Rising. The search led, I think, by frustrated Africans, middle class, urban, diaspora Africans in the UK and elsewhere, who felt frustrated by the way the continent was always reduced to wars and famine and suffering. And I think the BBC, well, I would say this, wouldn't I? But the BBC has led the way in delivering more sophisticated, more nuanced stories, and we have so much output, broadcasting back to Africa, but also broadcasting around the world. And it's not just about the piece that gets on the 10 o'clock news in the evening. There's a wealth of different perspectives and so on, and different correspondents. I'm one of the very, very few, if not the only, white foreign reporter here for the BBC now on the continent. So this is very much Africans telling Africa's story. And Africa Rising was about trying to, I suppose, correct decades of not overly simplistic, but a focus only on the negative. And it came at a time when, because China in particular was desperate for resources, desperate for all the raw materials of Africa, it was spending a lot here, it was investing, it was lending governments money. It was, and it still is, the kind of the new colonial power in Africa. And I say that with all the implications, the negative implications that are now becoming clear of empire and colonization, because I think Africans are realizing increasingly that they've been left in debt and that the money has not trickled down from governments in the way they'd hoped. And so, although there was an era of growing democratization across the continent and growing prosperity, it feels in a lot of places like it's, if not been squandered, it's at least been put on hold, and that a lot of the democratic process has stalled, and you get these kind of managed democracies in places like Uganda, which was such a shining light for so long, and now has curdled into that kind of classic strongman fake democracy where you have one party or one liberation movement clinging on to power. We've seen that in Zimbabwe and here in South Africa, which is, you know, still a democracy, but you know, people are concerned about the future of that democracy. You also, I mean, you've got one key issue, which is in the Sahel, which is in this vast region just south of the Sahara, which goes all the way from Somalia in the east, right the way over to Mauritania, through Chad, through Burkina Faso, through Nigeria, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. It's a very poor area. It's been hit very hard by climate change, so it's getting drier and drier, and it's really now struggling with Islamic militancy, which is partly a result of our intervention, for better or for worse, in Libya, when the West overthrew Colonel Gaddafi, but didn't manage to prevent all his arsenal of weapons going across the Sahara and then destabilizing countries like Mali. Mali was always held up as this incredible success story, which it was. I remember going to Timbuktu in 2010. Glorious tourism, French tourists everywhere. But already even then, concern about extremism. And now, of course, they've kicked the French out. There's been a military coup. The new military government has...
The Russians are in there.
Sold its soul to the Russians, the Wagner group, who've been doing unspeakable things in Ukraine, are now active in Mali. There's concerns that they're destabilizing Burkina Faso. They tried to destabilize Mozambique, Madagascar, and so on.
And I want to feed in, and I think this feeds into what we're talking about from Emma, and I hope you don't mind me saying this, Emma, you are a Zimbabwe native. She says, I do like your analysis of some of the problems facing South Africa. I would add to say Southern African governments have one major problem, which is corruption at the highest echelons of government. And this, unfortunately, has now become the African disease. Do you agree with that?
As always, I'm wary of those generalizations. I think there are some countries that are doing better for a variety of reasons. But yes, I think it's very difficult for countries in transition, countries trying to break away, not just from the liberation era, but from poverty, from disease, from poor development. Just as I suspect there was horrific corruption in the UK, centuries ago, just as we're seeing Ukraine and Eastern Europe struggling with similar issues. But Africa, yes, has a particular problem with corruption, and I think there's no getting around that. And the sources of that and where the blame should lie are deep and complex, and a lot of people have spent a lot of time failing to deliver it. And you look, it's a slightly simplistic tale, but if you look at Somalia, this country I've spent so much time focusing on, the West has spent so much time militarily, developmentally, throwing billions of dollars trying to rescue Somalia from the anarchy that it fell into in the 70s and 80s. And yet, if you look to the north of Somalia, there's a small place called Somaliland, which was once a British protectorate, which has only one main clan there, which helps explain why it's done so well. But it quietly, without any foreign help, without foreign recognition, has been forced to talk through its own problems, to rely on its diaspora, and to rely on its own democratization without these big multinationals and these giant international organizations coming in and essentially trying to steer these countries in the way they want them to go. And we can say the same for Afghanistan.
The less intervention, the better. Sue Townley sort of picks up on the thing you said about Somaliland there. It has a single clan. Do you think tribalism plays a part in the problems generally? It's different to racism, isn't it? Yeah, it's different.
It's very different, and it's often misunderstood. And it is, in a way, the clearest link back to the days of empire and of the scramble for Africa, and the fact that Africa's borders were not based on any local wishes or governments or plans. They were imposed, often straddling crudely and often deliberately, trying to play on tribal, ethnic, clan tensions to weaken. And so you get countries like Kenya that are, a bundle of different clans, and Tanzania as well. And yet, I think the point that I think really struck me was during the Ukraine war, in the very early days, when Russia had invaded Ukraine and the international community was demanding of Africa that it rally behind the West and behind Ukraine. And plenty of African countries were a little bit indignant. They were going, well, hang on, why are you simply assuming we'll support you? But it fell to the Ghanaians, but particularly to the Kenyans and their representative at the United Nations, who gave this extraordinarily powerful speech, which I urge you to go and look up, in which he said, look, we know more than any other part of the world, we in Africa know what imperialism is, we know what empire is, and we know the evils of that and the impact of that. And yet we Africans, by and large, have decided to live with those borders. And where we haven't lived with those borders, bloodshed has followed. And so mostly we have made our peace with those borders, even though in some places, Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, those borders have been redrawn. But by and large, African governments have very courageously and really very kind of generously stuck with the borders they've inherited. And the Kenyan message to the world was, Russia is an empire, Russia is an invader, we know what Russia is doing, so we're going to condemn Russia and support Ukraine, which is the victim of imperialism. And then, of course,
did that bring the African countries around or not?
No, I mean, I think, the African feeling is, firstly, we're dependent on, we are smaller countries, we are dependent on foreign aid, on grain. When the elephants fight, it's the grass that gets trampled, and we're not, we want to keep the peace, particularly that's the South African thing. We had a transition to democracy without going to war. So the ANC message is always, both sides step back, we can talk this out. I think a growing criticism of the South Africans on that, because they've tried to remain neutral when their constitution, and I think, the whole idea of South Africa being a leader on this continent was about taking strong moral stands. And yet in recent years, the ANC seems to have abandoned that. And also, I think that sense of expectation that Africa would simply fall behind the West without being properly consulted and brought along.
Yes, without consultation. Another point from Emma here. Totally agree that China is now the imperial power in Africa. Zimbabwe has completely fallen under China's influence. And no wonder why economically China is in charge. And then there's a nice story. There is a true story of how soil from Zimbabwe was flown to China to help fertilize a piece of land. Do you know about that, Andrew? What does that show us, Emma?
I was remembering when I lived for a while in Singapore, and Malaysia was literally selling its territory to Singapore in terms of islands and sand, because Singapore was endlessly trying to grow in size. So it would be taking barges full of sand, gouging them out of Malaysia and paying for the price, and then expanding its own territory. But yeah, it does show you the extent to which China has gained such influence. You know, it built the parliament buildings in new parliament buildings in Zimbabwe, and I think increasingly governments, particularly civil society in Africa, is waking up to the fact that it's massively in debt to China, and that the infrastructure that has been built here has often been very poorly built, and so they're saddled with debt, and they're saddled with construction projects that haven't always ended up to be quite as beneficial as they were.
I remember some 10 years or so ago, I went to Tanzania to do the China story, having been the China correspondent, and we ended up interviewing the Chinese ambassador in the same way that we would have been interviewing the American or British ambassador, but they were irrelevant, and we set up a full interview with the Chinese ambassador there. Of course, we wouldn't be able to do that now because relations have dipped a bit. A couple of issues I just want to touch with you about how Africa is seen from here. The immigration story that we have here, and the asylum seekers being sent to Rwanda. Now, not many people know the details about Rwanda. How is that seen how do Africans see how we see that here, or how it's being reported here?
There's a real concern about a drain of African talent, particularly in the health services. The number of countries, Australia, the UK, Canada, elsewhere, Ghana as well, whose nurses and locally trained medical staff are being poached by Western countries who, in the same breath, are going, oh no, we must support and fund and send our development experts to help these poor countries. Meanwhile, they steal all their talent. I mean, it's no surprise, perhaps, that some of these staff want to go to other countries. So, you know, you can't blame them if their governments are failing them at the same time. Rwanda is a complex case, and it falls into one of those brackets where different parts of Africa, I think, treat it very differently. You know, Rwanda's neighbors, particularly Democratic Republic of Congo, have been the victims for years of Rwandan meddling, which have caused huge problems for Congo. Elsewhere, you see governments in the same way, going back to Singapore, you know, governments in Asia look to Singapore, look to Vietnam, and see those extraordinary economic successes and go, you see, authoritarianism works. Well, Rwanda is an authoritarian state, very murderous authoritarian state, and yet it is very successful. It is very cohesive since the genocide, and it has been led, you know, in a way that a lot of African governments look to and go, well, hey, maybe they got something right. They're less corrupt than us. Their developmental indexes are very impressive. Their child mortality rates and so on have improved drastically, even though there's plenty of concern that those figures have been fiddled and that a lot of the money and the economic success has come from looting the neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo. There's still plenty of reason to look at Rwanda and wonder what lessons can be learned.
And what should, I mean, because it's a huge issue here, because the people that are crossing the channel in those boats have been put on planes or will about to be put on planes to Rwanda. And the way that it's debated in Parliament is as if they're going to Devil's Island or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, Rwanda's very safe. It's a police state. It's, you know, long term, who knows? It's basically got over the genocide of '94 with a government that said there is no ethnic tensions, because there is no such thing as the Hutus and Tutsis. These are colonial constructs. And yet the tensions still lurk below the surface. They've been pushed out to other countries. They've been pushed into exile. And it's not impossible that those tensions could surface again. So, but in the shorter term, no, I mean, Rwanda's stable. But it's interesting where the people fleeing Africa these days are coming from. And it's particularly from countries like Eritrea, South and North Sudan. These are really struggling countries, very violent, not very democratic. And so you can see why it is so much in Britain and the West's interest to try and help these countries find stability, to end conflict. And there was a time, a decade ago, when it felt like almost all the conflicts that I used to cover from Nairobi when I lived there in the early 2000s were ending. Now, mixed picture. But,
and one other point before, and then I want to move to Europe and Ukraine, is the debate here that we have about pulling down statues, the slavery legacy, the colonialism legacy, which is very big in the universities here and in certain parts of the media. Is that same debate going on in where you are?
It is, but I wouldn't say it's going on at a sort of societal level. It goes on amid the elites, if you like, African elites, the African urban and diaspora elites, who understandably are engaging with these issues and feel very strongly. In a country like South Africa, there is, because of the nature of its history and the fact that these issues are really only a generation old, since they were resolved in '94 with the transition to democracy, they still feel very visceral, understandably, to many Black South Africans. And so they are, I think, here they have real profound influence. I think in a lot of other parts of the continent, there are other priorities. There are more urgent issues, and I don't think they get that much attention.
It's a bit like the Kenyan ambassador to the United Nations said, we've got our borders, we've got our history, now we have to move on, as opposed to... Emma says, before we move to Europe, a true change will come when the old African politicians die off and the younger generation takes over, but it will happen, but maybe not during our time. What do you reckon?
Well, South Africa is a real issue of that, this sort of gerontocracy, that it's particularly true of countries where the Liberation Party ended up coming into power, and that sense of entitlement that's grown in so many countries. And then the party becomes the state, and the heroes who fought for liberation end up believing that they are due somehow endless power. And we see that in South Africa, where the ANC has been extraordinarily bad at bringing up a new generation of politicians. Everyone is in their 70s, and they've been in power for 20 odd years, and they've run out of ideas, and everyone knows that. The problem is the hurdle that almost every country in Africa struggles with, which is how to get beyond that, how to get to true multi-party, policy-based governments. I mean, there is hope. I think a country like Kenya increasingly is seeing its political sphere dominated by issues, by policies, rather than by ethnicity, which has always been the key there, and the dangerous, disruptive key. So I think there's cause for hope. Nigeria, of course, is the real focus, because so much, I think, for the whole of West and Central Africa hangs on Nigeria's transition to some kind of greater stability, particularly when you have these north-south tensions, the extremism, and this incredible youth bubble that we see in Nigeria, but we see across the continent. It's such an advantage when so many parts of the world are seeing their demographics shift and their populations shrinking, so much need for young talent, young energy. And you have that in bundles across Africa. All the opinion polls show young Africans, so talented, so energetic, and so eager to change their societies. But Africa has to find a way to tap into that. And for a long time, it seemed as if Ethiopia was successfully managing that, and Nigeria too. But it's the instability, the dangers of conflict, they are there as well. And so these next decades are going to be really important to be managed carefully, and for that youth bubble to be a benefit, not a curse.
Give us, because you've worked in so many places, touch a little bit on what common ground there is between Africa and Asia, or the Indo-Pacific as they call it now, and what difference there is in mindset. And then I want to go to Europe and Ukraine, or Europe and mindsets there.
Gosh, I don't know where to start on that. It's such a
well, you've only got 30
generalizations that I was saying I'm so desperate to avoid. I mean, I think Africans are the most hardworking people I have ever met, and that is because of the poverty that's been such that still traps so many parts of the continent, and the battle against poverty, which frankly, and people like Rory Stewart are very interesting on this, that has been lost. The developmental assistance for Africa has been a failure, and I don't think we've yet understood why that is. And I think issues like just simply giving money have not, rather than trying to redevelop, misdevelop, invest in governments and so on, rather than doing that, I think there should be more focus on economic growth, on supporting that, and also on simple cash transfers, which have been proven. And we saw this in Somalia just in the last few months. Give people money, and then they'll take care of themselves. It's poverty that's...
They know how to do. But Asia is...
It's not a misunderstanding of democracy. It's not a lack of ability. It's just that they're poor.
Yes, but Asia has got more of a sense of trade, making money, trickle down, would you say, or is that too much of a generalization?
This is to do with geography as well. That Africa has always struggled to trade with itself within Africa, and that's partly to do with the geography, the rivers, the lack of decent, navigable rivers that have allowed, people to transfer goods around. So they've always tended to look abroad, to look outside, and that's not always helped them.
Well, now we think in our mindsets here in the West of sort of, war and conflict in Africa or Asia, but in fact it's Europe that's the savage continent, because it's got a big proper war going on now that you have just come back from. Yeah, very true. A bloody 100 years on the European continent. What is it in our European mindset that makes us make these dreadful weapons and then go around killing each other and changing borders?
Humphrey, you keep asking me the same question in different guises. I'm not going to get I'm not going to get dragged into those generalizations, but I don't know. I mean. Borders.
Let me put it another way then, Andrew. You've just come back from Ukraine. You've just come back from the war. Tell us about it.
It's getting worse, and of course, I was in the Donbass on the front lines, and the overwhelming sense amongst the Ukrainians there is we can win this, but we can either win this quickly with a lot more Western weapons and help and far fewer deaths amongst our own people, or we can win it in the long term at vast cost to everybody and with hundreds of thousands of lives. There is concern that if it does turn into a longer war, and we've seen this with Russia, their appetite for longer conflicts and for immense suffering, certainly the Kremlin's appetite, is huge, and that's come from the fact that the Russian leadership has always very successfully propagandized and kept alive the memory of the enormous suffering in the Second World War. And so that is still the Russian perspective on conflict, whereas we tend to go, well, we fight, then it's over, and then we get on with our allies and enemies alike. The Russian perspective is of millions dead and of wars that never resolve themselves. And the Kremlin has always, in recent years, very cynically kept alive conflicts on its periphery because it sees that as a way to control its former empire, because it's still not at peace with the idea that it's lost its empire. And indeed, the way Putin talks now is of a man determined to rebuild that old Soviet and pre-Soviet empire. He's very explicit about that. And so this could go on for a long time. And yet, I mean, the Ukrainians are very determined, very inspirational. And even these soldiers who you talk to who are losing friends around them, they're going, our commanders are good. They're looking out for us. We support this war. We are not conscripts. We are not fighting a war that we don't understand, like so many Russians. We are in this to win it, and we will win it. So the determination there is as you see with Zelensky, you know, in his recent trip to London, that you can't fake that kind of determination. And that sense that, you know, whatever Ukraine's complicated history, the complicated fact that, you know, plenty of Ukrainians, particularly in the east of the country, speak Russian as a first language, have ethnic ties to Russia, and who might have settled for something more ambiguous in terms of geography and settlements. Now a new, very determined, very united Ukrainian country is taking shape and is being born because of Putin.
You've taken one piece of reporting you did there from one battle and turned it into a book, like These Are Not Gentle People, that's coming out soon. Tell us about the battle. Tell us how you did it.
So last March, in the early days of March, so this was a week after the Russian surprise invasion, the Russians were trying to sweep across the Black Sea coast from the Crimea all the way over to Moldova and Romania. And if they'd done that, Ukraine would have been landlocked and very, very vulnerable to a complete Russian victory, because they'd have seized Odessa, they'd already got the Crimea, they could have surrounded Ukraine on three sides and kept on pushing in. So it was a very critical part of the Russian war plan, sweep across the coastline. And they very nearly did it, except there was one bridge in one small farming town on a river just upstream from the coast. And there was a battle there that took place over 2 or 3 days. And had the Ukrainians lost it, then the south coast, the whole of south coast of Ukraine could have been lost to the Russians, and the war might have ended. Certainly the outcome could have been very different to what it is at the moment. And I went to that town a few days after the battle that took place there, and it got very little attention at the time, but I immediately clicked with some of the characters in this small farming community that had basically seen off the Russians and defended. In fact, they'd blown up their own bridge. So it's a kind of bridge too far story. And decided very quickly that I wanted to write something longer about it. And it ended up with a book that we decided to bring out very quickly, relatively quickly for books. So it's coming out in a few months' time.
And the title of the book?
Is not entirely settled. It might be called a stubborn town, or a small stubborn town, and something about Ukraine. But it's basically about the story of this farming community. And it's not a war book so much, and it's not a current affairs book. It is very much, as with These Are Not Gentle People, it's an attempt to write a novel that is true and that's particularly based around, for instance, the experience of a woman called Svetlana, who was an elderly, marvelous, garrulous peasant, I suppose she'd call herself, living in a cottage on the outskirts of town, whose cottage and cellar ended up being taken over by the Russians as their headquarter, then as a field hospital, and then one of her barns became a prison for all these eccentric different characters, from Russians who were trying to defect, Russian soldiers who were trying to defect, to Ukrainian farmers, to members of the sort of Dad's army that were captured while they were trying to fight off the Russians.
Yeah. So you take us right inside these sort of mixed communities as well.
So
because Emma asks,
all those involved, everyone who was in the shed. And these are people with very complicated backgrounds again. So, you know, in the village, there will be people who support Russia. There will be people who are Russian but have completely sided now with the Ukrainians. And then there will be overwhelmingly most of the town who are sort of fervently anti-Russian now.
And the town itself is a Ukrainian or ethnically Ukrainian or ethnically Russian?
Yes, it's called Voznesensk, which means ascension, which was a name that Catherine the Great, the Russian empress, gave it.
Right.
Decades, centuries back.
Andrew, I want you to sit there for 2 seconds whilst I tell our audience what we have coming up, and then I'm going to return to you because we've got another couple of thoughts from Emma, who's great here. February 16th, that is next week, I'm with Christina and Ryan Hillsberg on their hilarious book, License to Parent, How My Career as a Spy Helped Me Raise Resourceful, Self-Sufficient Kids. It's a hilarious read. And James Bond apparently was a dreadful spy, and don't even get them on the Bond girls. So we can do about that. February 17th, that is the next time with Bob Gourlay, the cyber threat. Know the threat to beat the threat. We are going to hear about how to keep our computers and phones safe, and whether our banks and our supermarkets and all those people we give our credit cards to keep those things safe too. February 23rd, Lucinda is here with the marvelous Marika Kobold, with her just published 8th novel, On Hampstead Heath, which tells the story of Thorn March, who was raised in a house of whispers, meaningful glances, and half-finished sentences. Sounds very dodgy to me. And then Lucinda again, 24th of February, the Goldster Book of the Month, reading and chatting about Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus, the brilliant new bestseller, been optioned for TV, and a debut novel written by a woman in her 60s. And that's no recording on that one, so you can all kick back and say what you want, and nobody will know about it. Just a quick one. If spying makes good parents, does journalism make good parents, Andrew?
I hope so. I've always told my kids that, you know, when I go off on these long travels, at least when I come back, I'm very focused, I'm there. I'm, you know, a hands-on parent, but I do remember giving a talk at their school here in South Africa, and you know, telling a few of my war stories. And at the end, this little 9-year-old putting his hand up and going, "Have you ever been spattered with somebody else's blood?" And I thought, oh dear, what am I telling these poor boys? But they all thought that was hilarious, and. Yes, I've yet to see whether my boys are going to become journalists or have wanderlust or react against it.
Yes, you've been doing these wars for a long time, haven't you? 30 years?
Yes. My first one was Chechnya, really, and first conflict was in 91, I guess. But yeah.
Does it have an impact?
Yeah, of course it does. I think boarding school probably had a bigger impact in terms of turning me into who I am. But I guess if I couldn't cope with it, I probably wouldn't keep doing it. But yes, I mean, I think, you know, we all affected in different ways by these experiences, and certainly, plenty of drama.
Yeah, and you like the drama, do you, as opposed to? I mean, if you were given a choice between going to the front line and doing the Oscars, which one would you go for?
It's weird with Ukraine because I know how the Russians fight. I covered Chechen wars, and they are terrifyingly brutal. And their artillery wars, which are the most dangerous and unpredictable. So there was a sense of nervousness about going back to Ukraine, but at the same time, I guess a sense of duty. You know, this is what I do. This is what I can do. This is, you know, my experience. I speak Russian, and this really felt like, you know, a very European war and something that I had to put my hand up for. So there's that as well.
Thank you, Andrew. These are not gentle people. It's going to be is going to be matched soon by the book with no name called A Stubborn Village or something like that from Ukraine, similar style of writing there, which is going to be telling a story deep into, I think we are out of time. What is Emma saying? Okay, a yes or no to this. In your personal life, have you ever been traumatized by any of the stories you've witnessed?
I've been, yes, deeply affected.
Deeply affected.
How could one not? I covered the tsunami.
Yes, deeply affected. Because that is it. Time's winged chariot is upon us. Thank you all for being with us virtually and in some time machine technology. Thank you all who will be joining us on the Andrew Harding Goldster podcast. And for everyone, until next time, stay active, stay curious, stay passionate, stay involved, and of course, stay Goldster. Thank you, Andrew, for a fantastic insight that you've given us into Africa, war reporting, that writing that we really love. And until next week with the Hillsbergs on parenting and spying. Bye. Thanks, Andrew. Great show. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.